Hello, thank you for joining me as I discuss the opera composer Philip Glass and evaluate and characterize his style in the 1980s as either minimalist or futurist. Now, by the early 1980s, Philip Glass had already established himself as one of the most prominent composers associated with the minimalist movement. His style, which often relied on repetitive structures and steady rhythms and gradual transformations, was a departure from the complex, dissonant textures of the 20th century avant-garde music. Minimalism was about simplicity, reducing music to its essential elements, creating pieces that allowed listeners to experience the passage of time and the subtle shifts within it. And throughout the 1980s, Glass continued to work within these parameters, creating some of his most iconic works. His Glassworks album of 1982, for example, marked a shift towards a more accessible sound without abandoning the core elements of minimalism. This album, which is often seen as a bridge between his earlier, more experimental works and his later, more popular compositions, combined classical and electronic elements, with Glass using synthesizers alongside traditional orchestral instruments. Despite the addition of synthesizers and more melodic content, the repetitive structures and slow evolving patterns in Glassworks are distinctly minimalist. And while we must respect that perspective, there is an argument that Philip Glass, although associated with minimalism, is ultimately much more aligned with futurism. Futurism in music, especially in music, is about pushing the boundaries of what we consider possible and using technology and innovation to create sounds that represent a leap forward. Now, Glass's music, especially in his later works in the 80s, takes advantage of technological advancements in both composition and performance. His collaboration with electronic instruments, synthesizers, and the use of computers to generate music demonstrates a visionary approach that transcends the more static, repetitive qualities of minimalism. Futurism is about vision, progress, and the breaking of traditional forms. And Glass's compositions, such as those in his Glassworks album and his film scores, embrace technological evolution in music. His work with film scores for The Truman Show or Koyaanisqatsi fuses acoustic and electronic elements in a way that feels futuristic, not just in terms of the sound, but the way it engages with visual media and modern culture. Futurism isn't just about creating chaos or dissonance. It's about transformation. Glass's integration of non-traditional forms, like the blend of opera, theater, and experimental music, reflects a desire to innovate and redefine what music can be. His ability to merge new music with new media aligns him with the ethos of futurism, which is concerned with progress, change, and the potential of the future. And, however, while that's all true, we cannot confuse the tools Glass uses with his underlying aesthetic. Yes, he incorporates synthesizers and electronic devices, but his musical language remains firmly minimalist. The repetitiveness, the focus on phase shifting, and the gradual development of motifs reflect a minimalist approach to composition. Futurism, in its purest sense, would demand a radical break from traditional tonality and structure, but Glass, despite his technological integration, still works within a tonal and rhythmic framework that is minimalist to its core. Glass's operas during the 1980s, such as Satyagraha of 1980 and Akhenaten of 1983, were also deeply rooted in minimalism. These works adhered to a distinctive structural approach, repetitive arias, rhythmic clarity, and an emphasis on texture over harmonic development. In Akhenaten, for example, Glass uses minimalist techniques to create a meditative, almost trance-like atmosphere, while the sparse instrumentation of the orchestra allowed for the beauty of the repetitive patterns to shine. And The idea of stripping away excess was still central to his work, and in this sense, Glass's music remained firmly grounded in minimalism throughout the 1980s. But I think when we're discussing futurism, we're missing the larger point, and that is that Glass may work within traditional tonalities, but he's innovating the forms of music, and that's where futurism comes into play. Futurism isn't about the rejection of tonality. It's about pushing what is possible within those structures. Glass is not merely repeating the past, he's recontextualizing it. His work, especially in film, resonate with a distinctly modern, forward-thinking energy that anticipates the future. Take the aforementioned Koyaanisqatsi of 1982, for instance. This piece was paired with the imagery of urban decay and environmental collapse, creating a narrative that felt deeply prophetic. The music embodies the energy of the future, relentless, mechanical, and at times overwhelming. Even in his chamber works, Glass's compositions are about expanding what we know music can do. He takes simple ideas and transforms them, making them seem complex through sheer repetition and variation. And that's not minimalist in the traditional sense. It's futuristic in how it approaches music as an evolving form, one that looks toward what's next rather than lingering in what has come before. But for minimalism, just to combat that last point, I have to say that is more about context and interpretation rather than the music itself. Glass's work, especially in collaborations with film and video, like the futuristic argument suggests, are undoubtedly modern, but the music itself, if taken in isolation, does not break radically from minimalist principles. The tension that we're talking about, that sense of the modern world, comes from how the music interacts with the visuals, not from a truly futuristic approach to composition. His minimalism is, in essence, an aesthetic choice, one that allows the listener to experience the present moment deeply rather than anticipating something beyond. And as for more specific examples of his work that reflect futurism, the most notable example of Glass's engagement with futurism during the 1980s was his film scores, perhaps particularly, we've already mentioned Koyaanisqatsi, and as well as The Thin Blue Line of 1988. But as for Koyaanisqatsi, directed by Godfrey Reggio, it used a combination of stunning imagery and Glass's electronic-heavy score to explore themes of industrialization, technological advancement, and environmental destruction. The film's title, which means life out of balance in Hopi, and its exploration of the consequences of modernity resonated deeply with Glass's evolving musical voice. The repetitive, driving rhythms of the music mirrored the constant motion and disorienting pace of technological progress. The score reflected a world on the brink of change, one shaped by technological forces that were often uncontrollable and unpredictable. But just for a final word, I'll say that throughout the 1980s, Glass continued to straddle the line between minimalism and futurism. His music, while deeply rooted in minimalist principles, began to explore the potential of new technology and the changing landscape of the cultural moment. And the repetition and structures of his work was still very minimalist, but his use of synthesizers, electronic loops, and multimedia elements pushed his music toward a more futuristic aesthetic. His collaborations with film, dance, and theater also helped to create new forms of expression that embrace the possibilities of the future, while still maintaining a core focus on clarity and simplicity. So perhaps the best way to describe Glass's music in the 1980s is to see it as a bridge between the minimalist movement and the emerging futurist ethos of the late 20th century. His works were minimalist in their focus on structure, repetition, and the beauty of simple patterns, but they were also increasingly futurist in their engagement with the technological advances and multimedia advances of the world, responding to the cultural climate of a rapidly changing existence. Thank you very much.